Charles Darwin because, of course, the Galapagos Islands are synonymous, in my mind at least, with, and I guess most people's minds, with Charles Darwin. I've given out two sheets here for non-biologists. I've put there a summary of Darwin's ideas, undoubtedly in their day very profound. His ideas basically can be summarised in 3 observations and 2 conclusions. Number 1, all species have the potential to reproduce geometrically, and that is that 2 parents can give rise to 4, they can give rise to 8 and 16 offspring, etc. But in spite of this, the number in a species remains approximately constant over a period of time. They are observations, and these lead to the logical conclusion that there is a competition for survival. If all of those individuals that if all of those individuals that are born can't survive to reproduce, then there must be competition for survival. The third observation is that in every species there's variation. And the conclusion from this is that, therefore, in the competition for survival, the best adapted organisms survive at the expense of the less well adapted. And an assumption here is that the favourable characteristics are able to be inherited, at least in part. There is a heritable contribution. Darwin wasn't the first to put forward such a logical argument. And I've given you over onto the next page. It's about a page and a half of a chapter from a book by Patrick Matthew, written in 1831. Point 1 is the law of natural selection, and 2, the exclusion of Lamarckism. And Lamarck's ideas were that organisms change in response to environmental influences. And that came from a book called On Naval Timber and Arboriculture. And as I say, I'll leave you to read that in your own time. But it sets out Darwin's ideas even more succinctly than Darwin did in his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Actually, Darwin was a fascinating person, and his background, I believe, was equally fascinating. Darwin was born on February the 12th, 1809, and he died on April the 19th, 1882. He died a bit over 100 years ago, and he was 73 years old when he died. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, and again, because of the problems that the church perceived from his ideas, even that was quite remarkable, that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey. He, of course, was never knighted. Darwin's background, in the, if you like, the shortest sense, went back to his grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, who died before Charles Darwin was born. Dr. Erasmus Darwin was born in 1731 and died in 1802. He was known for his epic poem Zoonomia, and he belonged to the Lunar Club. And the aim of the Lunar Club was to investigate anything new. And his son and Charles's father was Dr. Robert Darwin, born in 1766 and died in 1848. And Dr. Robert Darwin was known, he was a physician, and he was known as a very capable diagnostician, and in fact his diagnoses were sought from widely around. In 1796, maybe we should plot this. There was Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather, Dr. Robert Darwin, physician, and 1766 to 1848, and in 1796 he married Susanna Wedgwood. And Susanna Wedgwood was one of the family of the Wedgwood potters. And her father was Josiah Wedgwood, and he was the potter, and in fact was the first to try to apply scientific and chemistry principles to pottery and to glazes in pottery. There was, of course, an earlier family, went right back to the 17th century, the Wedgwoods as the potters, but it was Josiah Wedgwood that established the modern pottery in this period. It was in 1768 that Josiah Wedgwood joined with Thomas Bentley. They became partners, and they were the ones who initiated the unglazed stoneware. Now, Susanna Wedgwood's brother was also Josiah Wedgwood II, and he was Uncle Jos to Charles Darwin. Charles was born February the 12th, 1809, and he was the fifth of 6 children. His mother died when he was aged 8 years, and at the age of 9 he was sent off to boarding school at Dr. Samuel Butler's school in Shrewsbury, and he studied, as was natural then, the classics, history and geography, and the records are that he was a slower learner than his sister Catherine. His elder brother Erasmus Darwin studied chemistry and also had an interest in biology. Now, as I indicated, Charles's mother died. Susanna died when Charles was 8, so that was 1817. And so from that time onward, he didn't have the mother's influence around the home. And his father was rather strict, ruled with a bit of a firm hand in the house, and considered that his sons would go and do medicine. Erasmus, the son, went off to Edinburgh to do medicine, and Charles Darwin went to Edinburgh University as well. He joined Edinburgh University to study medicine on October the 22nd, 1825, and he left in April 1827. Basically because he didn't like medicine, he enjoyed the natural sciences and he enjoyed biology more. He said to his dad, being a dismal failure, not following his father's footsteps and going into medicine, that he wanted to enter the clergy. And of course there was a very high, or a very close tie between the clergy and the universities in those days. And so Charles Darwin went off to Christ's College in Cambridge. And at Christ's College in Cambridge he studied botany and geology. And 2 men who were to play a great part in his later work and life were the professor of biology and the professor of geology. Henslow was the professor of botany and Sedgwick was the professor of geology. Now, at the end of Darwin's undergraduate years, it was planned, and in fact it occurred, that Darwin was to go on a geological expedition to Wales with Professor Sedgwick and other students from that time. But it was Henslow, who was the professor of botany, who had a great influence on Darwin's future. When Darwin was at Cambridge, he was known as the man who walks with Henslow, because they had apparently an affinity between them. And of a Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Henslow kept an open house, and Darwin used to go there for tea and discussions with Henslow. And as I say, he became the man who walked with Henslow. It turned out that Sedgwick, in fact, in later years, opposed Darwin's views. But as I say, in 1831, Darwin went off to Wales on a geological expedition with Sedgwick and other students. I'll now read a letter written on the 11th of July 1831 by Charles Darwin to the Reverend Professor Henslow. My dear sir, I should have written to you some time ago, only I was determined to wait for the clinometer, and I'm very glad to say I think it will answer admirably. I put all the tables in my bedroom at every conceivable angle and direction. I'll venture to say I've measured them as accurately as any geologist going could do. It cost 25 shillings made of wood, but the lid with plate of brass graduated. Carey did not approve of a bar for the plumb, so that I had heavy ball instead. I've been working at so many things that I've not got on much with geology. I suspect the first expedition I take, clinometer and hammer in hand, will send me back very little wiser and a good deal more puzzled than when I started. As yet, I have only indulged in hypotheses, but these are such powerful ones that I suppose if they were put into action but for one day, the world would come to an end. I think this is extremely enlightening of Darwin. Here he is, just finished university, going out to Wales, and already hypotheses are racing through his mind, ideas. And he says that, as yet I've only indulged in hypotheses, but they are such powerful ones that I suppose if they were put into action but for one day, the world would come to an end. I've not heard from Professor Sedgwick, so I'm afraid he will not pay the 7 formations a visit. I hope and trust you did your best to urge him. And now for the Canaries, because Henslow was planning a trip to the Canary Islands. The little information which I got in town. But as perhaps he had left Cambridge, I will rehearse it. Passage £20, ships touch and return during the months of January to February. But not seeing myself the broker, the 2 most important questions remain unanswered, namely whether it means June inclusive and how often they sail. I will find this out before very long. I hope you continue to fan your Canary ardour. I read and reread Humboldt. Do you do the same? And I'm sure nothing will prevent us seeing the great dragon tree. Would you tell Leonard Jennings that his magnificent present of Diptera has not been wasted on me? Would you ask him how he manages Diptera when too small for a pin to go through? I am very anxious to hear how Mrs. Henslow is. I'm afraid she'll wish me to the bottom of the Bay of Biscay for having been the first to think of the Canaries. I'm going now to trouble you with several questions. Do you know A-Way's direction? Do you by any chance recollect the name of a fly that Mr. Bird sent through Downs? And now for a troublesome commission. Would you be kind enough to exert your well-known judgment and discretion in choosing for me a Stilton cheese, fit for eating pretty soon, Would you have it directed to Shrewsbury, and I will pay the man when I come up in October. Excuse all the trouble I'm giving you, and believe me, my dear sir, yours ever most sincerely, Charles Darwin. I must confess it's not usual these days for professors to go out and buy a Stilton cheese for one of their students, and particularly not to write in July and say you'll pay for it when you come up in October. But I think it illustrates the special relationship that Darwin and Henslow had. It so happened that Henslow was approached by the Reverend George Peacock. The Reverend George Peacock was the Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge University. And Peacock, in turn, knew Captain Beaufort. Francis Beaufort? It doesn't really matter. Captain Beaufort. Captain Beaufort at the time was the Royal Navy hydrographer, fellow who was responsible for getting maps drawn for the Royal Navy. Beaufort also was the originator of the Beaufort scale of winds. Do we have any... Andrew knows about the Beaufort scale of winds. My knowledge of the Beaufort scale of winds comes from we joined the Navy. The Facts of Life Ashore on a Floater's Navy Recruits Learn Them, a riot as a bestseller, authentic to the last drunken Liberty man. Well, this is about a naval academy. And it says here, the Boettcher was the most competent lecturer. The Beaufort scale, he said one morning, is a convenient method of expressing the force of winds. Naval officers are supposed to be like fishermen. They exaggerate everything. What you and I would call a howling gale, having been through it, some civil servant sitting on his bottom in a safe office ashore would call a slight chop. But if they see a number, they might possibly believe you. It's all done by numbers. Naught is defined as calm with a wind speed of less than 1 knot. Smoke rises vertically, branches of trees are motionless. Whole days play at Old Trafford. Farmers complain of the drought, and so on. 6 is a strong breeze, wind 22 to 27 knots. Smacks have double reefs, large branches in motion, telegraph wires whistle. You can't put up an umbrella. Farmers complain about the apple crop, and so on. 12 is a hurricane, and if you're ever in one, you won't need a Beaufort or any other kind of scale to tell you about it. Defined as wind speeds above 65 knots. Widespread damage inland. Air Ministry roof blown off. Yacht crews take up dry fly fishing. Wilfred Nichols organises a relief fund. Farmers complain of the floods, and so on. So much for the Beaufort scale. Well, the Beaufort scale, that scale of winds, was developed by Captain Francis Beaufort, who had contacted the Reverend George Peacock, Professor of Astronomy, and said, hey, Captain Fitzroy is going out to chart some of the coast of South America and come back again, and wouldn't it be a great idea for a biologist or collector of natural history to go with him? And this was the thing to do in those days. Augustus Earle went along as an artist on board the Beagle. Fitzroy was going along and said, okay, how about a biologist? Somebody who can collect items of natural history, because in those days that was what biology was. Natural history, collecting and classifying and comparing and getting new organisms. So the position was open to Henslow. The first person that Henslow thought of was Leonard Jennens. This was Henslow's son-in-law, and who was referred to in the letter I read to you from Darwin to Henslow. Henslow himself even thought of going. But ultimately, on the 24th of August 1831, Henslow wrote to Darwin, "My dear Darwin, before I enter upon the immediate business of this letter, let us condole together upon the loss of our inestimable friend, poor Ramsay, of whose death you've undoubtedly heard long before this. I'll not now dwell upon this painful subject, as I shall hope to see you shortly, fully expecting that you will eagerly catch at the offer which is like to be made to you of a trip to Terra del Fuego and home by the East Indies. I've been asked by Peacock, who will read and forward this to you from London, to recommend him a naturalist as a companion to Captain Fitzroy, employed by government to survey the southern extremity of America. I've stated that I consider you to be the best qualified person I know of who's likely to undertake such a situation. I state this not on the supposition of your being a finished naturalist, but as amply qualified for collecting, observing and noting anything new to be noted in natural history. Peacock has the appointment at his disposal, and if he cannot find a man willing to take the office, the opportunity will probably be lost. Captain Fitzroy wants a man, I understand, more as a companion than a mere collector, and would never take anyone, however good a naturalist, who was not recommended to him likewise as a gentleman. Particulars of salary, etc., I know nothing. The voyage is to last 2 years, and if you take plenty of books with you, anything you please may be done. You'll have ample opportunities at command. In short, I suppose there never was a finer chance for a man of zeal and spirit. Captain Fitzroy is a young man. What I wish you to do is to come instantly to town and consult with Peacock at number 7 Suffolk Street, Pall Mall East, or else at the University Club, and learn further particulars. Don't put on any modest doubts or fears about your disqualifications, for I assure you I think you are the very man they are in search of. Do conceive yourself to be tapped on the shoulder by your bum bailiff and affectionate friend, J.S. Henslow. P.S. The expedition is to sail on the 25th of September at the earliest, so there's no time to be lost." So there was the offer. As I hope to bring out, I believe that Darwin was the right man in the right place at the right time. Darwin received the letter and wrote back to Henslow, "My dear sir, Mr. Peacock's letter arrived on Saturday and I received it late yesterday evening. As far as my own mind is concerned, I should, I think, certainly most gladly have accepted the opportunity which you so kindly have offered me. But my father, although he doesn't decidedly refuse me, gives such strong advice against going that I should not be comfortable if I didn't follow it. My father's objections are these: the unfitting me to settle down as a clergyman, my little habit of seafaring, the shortness of time, and the chance of my not suiting Captain Fitzroy. It's certainly a very serious objection, a very short time for all my preparations, as not only body but mind wants making up for such an undertaking. But if it had not been for my father, I would have taken all the risks. What was the reason that a naturalist was not long ago fixed upon? I'm very much obliged for the trouble you've had about it. There certainly could not have been a better opportunity. I shall come up in October to Cambridge, when I long to have some talk with you. I will write to Mr. Peacock at Denton, but his direction is written so badly that even with the assistance of the post office I'm not certain about it. Would you therefore be so kind, if you know his or Captain Fitzroy's direction, would you send one line to the same effect? My trip with Sedgwick answered most perfectly. I did not hear of poor Mr. Ramsay's loss till a few days before your letter. I've been lucky hitherto in never losing any person for whom I've had any esteem or affection. My acquaintance, although very short, was sufficient to give me those feelings in a great degree. I can hardly make myself believe he is no more. He was the finest character I ever knew. Yours most sincerely, my dear sir, Charles Darwin." So, Charles Darwin didn't go. It's all a myth. What happened was Darwin felt down in the mouth. He wanted to go, but his father said no. Unlike his own house, which was rather rigidly run and strictly controlled by Dr. Robert Darwin, Maya, which was the house of the Wedgwoods, was a happy household. They had lots of parties, and of course there were all the Wedgwood girls. They had girls there as well. So Darwin went over to Maya, spoke to the Wedgwoods, and Charles then wrote from Maya to his own father. Actually, I should have shown this to my sons because they could really get a few pointers out of this. My dear father, I'm afraid I'm going to make you again very uncomfortable, but upon consideration I think you will excuse me once again stating my opinions on the offer of the voyage. My excuse and reason is the different way all the Wedgwoods view the subject from what you and my sisters do. I've given Uncle Joss what I fervently trust is an accurate and full list of your objections, and he's kind enough to give his opinion on all. The list and his answers will be enclosed, but may I beg of you one favour? It will be doing me the greatest kindness if you will send me a decided answer, yes or no. If the latter, I should be most ungrateful if I did not implicitly yield to your better judgment and to the kindest indulgence which you have shown me all through my life. And you may rely upon it, I will never mention the subject again. And so he went on, and ultimately he said, I do not know what to say about Uncle Joss's kindness. I never can forget how he interests himself about me. Believe me, my dear father, your affectionate son, Charles Darwin. And of course, Uncle Joss took all of the points and wrote answers to them. You know, number one, I shouldn't think it would be in any degree disreputable to his character as a clergyman. I should, on the contrary, think the offer honourable to him, and the pursuit of natural history, though certainly not professional, is very suitable to a clergyman. And so it goes on. And on September the 2nd, 1831, a short note to Henslow, my dear sir, I am just arrived. You will guess the reason. My father has changed his mind. I trust the place is not given away. I'm very much fatigued and am going to bed. I dare say you've not yet got my second letter. How soon shall I come to you in the morning? Send a verbal answer. Good night. Yours, C. Darwin. So Darwin was in Cambridge. His father had said yes. And now to go down to Plymouth, see Fitzroy and get on board the ship. But there was another naturalist who was being considered at the time, but Fitzroy, a captain in the Navy at the age of 26, already he'd been down to the southern extremity of South America, a religious man, and he had considered or hoped that Darwin might be able to bring back evidence of the Great Flood and Noah from his collecting down in South America. On his previous visit, Fitzroy had brought back 3 natives from Tierra del Fuego. Fuegia Basket, Jemmy Buttons and York Minster. He brought them back to England, put them in Western clothes, schooled them at his own expense, and he hoped that they would go back to Tierra del Fuego to take Christianity down to the heathens of that area. Jimmy Buttons, in particular, was a bit of a dandy and really liked dressing up, and he especially liked white gloves. And they were to be returned down to Tierra del Fuego. As it turned out, when Darwin met Fitzroy, the pair of them joined or liked each other right from the beginning, and it turned out that they retained a liking and an admiration for each other right through their lives. Fitzroy at that age was 26, but it was 23 years when he was first given command of the Vale. As I've indicated, he was to go down the southern coast of Tierra del Fuego, survey the South American shores and come home via the East Indies. Well, I was just looking for some dates. The reason is that, as was indicated, the Beagle was due to sail at the earliest on the 25th of September. It certainly didn't sail on the 25th of September. In fact, it was December before they got underway. Well, I guess it doesn't matter a great deal. But what happened was that they tried for the second time to get away on the 26th of December 1831, but the crew was too drunk. And so ultimately the Beagle got away on the 27th of December 1831. The voyage was to last 2 years. Ultimately, they returned on the 2nd of October 1836. So it was almost 5 years. The whole idea with Darwin going was that he would collect at various places, parcel up the specimens that he'd collected, and then send them back to Henslow in Cambridge. This was the first time that Darwin had done it, and of course some of his preservation of specimens, some of his packing, some of the specimens were not put in with enough poison, etc., and a number of the specimens got back to Cambridge in rather poor condition. And postage then wasn't as good as it is now, and it was a couple of years later before Darwin could get any feedback from Henslow as to the condition that his specimens arrived in. I have here a couple of overheads indicating the passage of the Beagle around the world. The Beagle left, in fact, from Plymouth, and the first port of call was the Canary Islands. They weren't permitted to land at the Canary Islands because of fear of cholera. The local authorities feared that a ship from Europe could bring cholera, wouldn't let them off. They saw sharks and caught sharks, and many fish were bitten in half by sharks that they caught there. They called into the Cape Verde Islands and then down to Brazil, to Rio, Montevideo, and right along the coast here. Darwin was permitted, and it was quite easy for him to get off and go on shore for a couple of weeks whilst the ship went up and down charting the coast, and then they would call back in for him. In Rio de Janeiro, a shooting party went up the river to shoot, of course, and a number of the sailors caught a fever and 2 of them died. So they were aware that there were diseases in South America that they really hadn't experienced at home. They came down here to Tierra del Fuego, dropped off the 3 natives, and then the Beagle went up and down the coast charting more. They called back in there, and by that time Jemmy Buttons had married a native woman. They came in their dugout canoe to the side of the Beagle. Jemmy Buttons came on board and had a meal with the sailors on board the Beagle, but his wife stayed down in the dugout and wailed the whole time that Jemmy Buttons was on board. Not surprisingly, it wasn't very long before all of the natives down there died out, in the same way as natives have in many places of the world, from TB, measles, and the usual diseases that we carry with us, and respiratory tract infections. And right around Cape Horn into Valparaiso, the Galapagos Islands, across the Pacific, to the Bay of Islands in New Zealand, called into Sydney, to Hobart, King George's Sound, up to the Cocos of Keeling Islands, across here past Mauritius, around the Cape of Good Hope, to St Helena, the Ascension Islands, back to Brazil, and then back home again via the Western Isles in this voyage, which took somewhere about 5 years. Of course, it was a fascinating voyage for Darwin. Darwin found rich fossil beds in South America. He saw there the fossils of many animals that had previously been unrecorded. I think I must have shuffled my notes. Dreadful. One thing that I forgot to mention was that Fitzroy on board the Beagle shared a cabin with Fitzroy. And Fitzroy, of course, being a hydrographer, needed to plot his position very well and took with him 20 chronometers packed in sawdust. They shared their cramped cabin, and the only way that Darwin could go to bed at night was to take the top drawer out of chest of drawers, and his feet went into the place of the top drawer of the chest of drawers. The other thing was that when the Beagle first sailed on December the 24th, on Christmas Eve, Darwin was seasick. When the ship sailed on the 27th of December 1831, Darwin was again seasick, and in fact he was seasick for the whole of the voyage. But he never really wanted to get off. It was in southern Argentine that Darwin found the excellent fossil deposit of bones. There were animals that were previously unknown. There were giant sloths, a giant armadillo, an extinct elephant, and a wild llama as big as a camel. And Darwin at that stage wondered about the relationship between these past giant animals and the present smaller day replicas. He also found the bones of a horse. At the time, Darwin wondered what had caused the animals to die out. And along the Argentinian coast, Darwin made 2 shore trips whilst the Beagle sailed up and down the coast. In Chile, Darwin took a trip into the Andes, and at 12,000 feet up into the air, he came across a bed of fossil seashells. On the same trek, lower down at 7,000 feet, he found petrified pine trees that had marine rock deposits on them. And at the time, Darwin recognised that this part of South America had at some stage been beneath the sea. Otherwise you couldn't have got the fossil seashells. And then in recent times the area had been elevated. Further, to find petrified pine trees with marine rock deposits on them indicated that here there'd been some wooded islands. Then movements of the earth had brought these up into a cold climate, up 7,000 feet, where there was no vegetation at all. And that the movements of the earth would have been accompanied by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Now, Darwin was aware of geology, and a very influential book at the time, which Darwin had with him on the voyage, was Lyell's book on principles of geology. And Lyell one major concept was... Good evening. Good evening. And Lyell's concept was that the mechanisms or the activities that we see going on Earth now have always gone on, and that we're only seeing the Earth at one portion of its change. Now, by chance, when the Beagle was off the southern coast of Chile on the 20th of February 1835, there was a bad earthquake. At the time, Darwin was ashore, and he in fact felt the earthquake. So this is the 20th of February 1835. The port of Talcahuano, which the Beagle visited, was a complete wreck. They learned from the inhabitants that there had been earthquake or earth tremors and shocks, and that the bay of Talcahuano had emptied, and then the water had roared in 3 times. First of all, it had emptied, the water had come in, it had emptied, the water had come in, it had emptied again, and the water had come in 3 times. Inland, not only was the port affected, but the town of Concepcion was demolished in 6 seconds. Further than this, the survivors were able to tell Darwin that the ground here in southern Chile was now higher than it had been before the earthquake. So that Darwin at first hand had seen evidence of geological change, fossil seashells now 12,000 feet above the sea, petrified trees in a treeless area, also with seashells on them, and the havoc caused by an earthquake and a whole township demolished in just 6 seconds. Later on, with this concept that the Earth changes with time, Darwin went to the Cocos or Keeling Islands. He there learned that these were coral islands, but that the islands were in deep water, far too deep for coral to grow. And at the time, Darwin reasoned, well, coral only grows near the surface of water. It can't grow deep. So what we're now seeing, where the base of these coral islands are, must have been up at the surface at some stage, and gradually the seafloor dropped. But it was slowly and slow enough for the coral growth to keep up with the dropping of the seafloor. It's now considered that Darwin's views on the origin of the Cocos Islands is correct. And in 1842, Darwin published a book, The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs. And a couple of years ago, the Cocos Islands issued a set of stamps commemorating Darwin's visit, his correct ideas on the formation of the Cocos Islands, and in fact some of Darwin's own drawings. Of course, it's the Galapagos Islands that are most notable on Darwin's voyage. And I'll do it. Thank you. Darwin found a number of rather bizarre organisms. This is Opuntia, the prickly pear, which on the Galapagos Islands, did I say Cocos or Galapagos? On the Galapagos Islands grows as big as a tree. There is the prickly pear tree. There's the giant land tortoise, the land iguana or lizard, and the marine iguana. And these were organisms that were grazing, like sheep in Australia. And Darwin wondered about these because the Galapagos Islands are about 1,000 kilometres off the coast of Ecuador, and like Hawaii, were created by volcanic eruption from the sea floor. He also found there a number of birds, and particularly the birds we now refer to as Darwin's finches. And here is a photograph of a finch. We'll show a drawing of him afterwards. Camarhynchus pallidus. It's the only bird known to use an implement to get its food. It has in here a spine from Opuntia, the prickly pear, to get out its grubs, etc., from under the bark of trees. Darwin's finches are a group of finches of different species. They don't breed together. They're basically somewhat similar in appearance, males being very dark in plumage and the females this speckled colour. I'll show a couple of colour drawings shortly. But the big difference between them is not colours or appearances, but in the shape of the beak. Now, these finches are close relatives and look very much like finches on Ecuador. They build the same sort of nest, which is a nest that's got a sloping roof on it, a body into the nest and a single hole for entrance. The sloping roof, of course, keeps the water off in tropical countries. So it turns out that a pair of finches will go along and build a nest, and then that nest will be occupied by any finches around. The other finches, even of other species, will come and use the nest built by somebody else. So it's quite obvious that they are closely related species and related to the birds from the Ecuador. Tough beak of a seed-eating finch, longer beaks, and in fact I guess they're not very different from humans, because in their courting displays it's when the male gets a look at the female's beak that he decides whether he will continue with the courting or whether he won't. And it is this structure of the beak. We have here the small ground finch and the medium-sized ground finch, and these are finches that in fact live on the ground, and the paintings were done of course by the naturalist John Gould. And here is the cactus ground finch, and you see the much longer beak on these. They are not seed eaters, and in fact these will live on insects. And this is Camarhynchus pallidus, where it has adopted the way of life of a woodpecker, but lacking the long tongue of a woodpecker, uses a spine out of the prickly pear to get its prey out from the pieces of bark that it's actually loosened off. Darwin thought about these finches, their relationships between Ecuador, why it was that there were land iguanas wandering around and tortoises, and of course ultimately came to the conclusion that if you blow up islands from out of the bottom of the Pacific Ocean from volcanic origins, then initially the surface will be sterile. Nothing will be there. Gradually you'll get some erosion, and you might get some small fragments of rock and what we might ultimately call rather crude soil. But that migration to the islands would simply be chance migration. Birds blown off their path, seeds that float there, and this sort of thing. And this was contrary to the concept of the religious people at the time of divine creation, and that God would put the appropriate organisms in the appropriate environment. Darwin got the idea, well, if you get chance migration of organisms out to these islands, it'd be great. They will grow up and they will reproduce in geometric proportions, so you'll get a population explosion. There'll be no predators there. So food becomes limiting. All the little ground finches who live on seeds, there's no seeds left. So those finches that can adopt an alternative food source, they can survive because they don't have competitors. And this was the concept that Darwin got. The tortoises, the browsing tortoises, grazing over the land. Nothing to compete with them. So slow and, if you like, inefficient by comparison with many of the mammals. Nevertheless, since they didn't have competitors, they could live there just like the land and the marine iguanas. When Darwin came home, he suffered from rather ill health for the rest of his life. Nobody is really sure what was wrong with him, but there was a thought that he may have got an infection whilst he was in South America. One thing which Darwin was interested in all of his life was in collecting beetles. In fact, whilst he was in Cambridge, he was collecting beetles, had one in each hand and wanted to collect a third, so he put the first one in his mouth. While he went for the third one, it exuded a spray of poisonous and very nasty fluid, and Darwin, of course, spat it out and was concerned that he had lost this beetle rather than that his mouth had actually suffered any problems. Darwin, whilst he was down in South America, we know from records, had a pet Benchuga bug. And the Benchuga bug is now known to carry a disease called Chagas's disease. And what Darwin used to do was have this soft black-bodied bug, and it had a horn out the front. And he'd put it on the table and put his finger down, and the bug would get there straight in and put its proboscis in to get a feed of blood about once a month from Charles Darwin. And it's thought possible that Darwin got an infection from that bug, and that this was why, for the rest of his life, he was a bit of a recluse, a semi-invalid. As I've indicated, the Beagle came back to Falmouth on the 2nd of October 1836. Now Darwin, in his life, was never employed. His father, of course, had independent means, and in 1848, when Darwin's father died, Darwin was left a pension for life of £5,000 a year. And in 1848, 5,000 English pounds, which is more than $10,000 a year at the present time, and for students that sounds a lot of money, it was a sizable income in those days. And Darwin worked about 4 hours per day. The rest of the day he walked and read novels. And in 1842, Darwin wrote 35 pages. And this was to be the foundations of the origin of species. It was written in pencil and was found under the stairs in a cupboard by his son after he had died. And there was just 35 pages, which was the foundations of the origin of species. So that was 1842, before he ever even got around to putting pen to paper. This was expanded to 230 pages in 1844. Now Darwin spent 10 years classifying barnacles. And as I indicated, in those days, what people were interested in doing was getting items, trying to classify them, trying to relate different species with one another. And he spent 10 years classifying barnacles and trying to work out the relationships between the barnacles that he collected. And of course, barnacles would stand up to being kept for quite a long time, and so they were convenient for him. Now, in 1838, the Reverend Thomas Malthus wrote his essay on population. Now, Malthus's thesis was that just as ultimately Darwin came up with, every species, including man and Malthus, considered man only, not other species, that man was increasing in number, and that there was a finite level to the world's capacity to produce food, and that one day, if we didn't limit our population, we'd get to a stage where starvation would control how many people there were on the earth. And this was Malthus's essay in 1838. Just as an oddity, the first name for a condom was in fact the Malthus sheath, because of Malthus's concept that we really had to limit the human species. Well, Darwin read Malthus's essay. Now, Darwin didn't rush out and publish The Origin of Species. In July 1858, there was a man out in the East Indies, Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace was impressed in the East Indies with the two islands which were adjacent of Bali and Lombok. The reason is that Bali had Asian flora and fauna, whereas Lombok had Australasian flora and fauna. And Wallace got to thinking, gee, why are these two islands, the closest in Indonesia, or the East Indies as they were called then, should they have very different flora and fauna, yet they are in the same area of the world? And he came up with ideas, just like Darwin did, that there's competition for survival, and in fact it was Wallace who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. Although we think in terms of Darwin with survival of the fittest, and in fact in his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin does use the term survival of the fittest, but that was Wallace's concept. Wallace asked Darwin to read his essay, and if he felt that it was worth publishing, would he please have it published on his behalf. And Darwin wondered how he could treat this, because Wallace was putting down on paper what he, Darwin, had concluded. And in fact, it was the 1st of July 1858, not when he received Wallace's essay, he received that on the 18th of June. But it was on the 1st of July 1858 that a joint paper was presented to the Linnaean Society by Darwin and Wallace on The Origin of Species. And it was the 20th of July when Darwin said, right, now I'll start writing my book, The Origin of Species. He'd been a bit hesitant to get on with it. And it was on the 24th of November 1859 that The Origin was first published. There were 1,250 issues of The Origin published, and they were all sold out on the first day. It was 1860 when the second edition came out. And at that stage, of course, there was quite a deal of controversy raised. The church were against Darwin and the concept that species were not made by God, and the concept that species can evolve. One point that I forgot to mention was that when Darwin got home from the voyages to the Beagle, the voyage of the Beagle, he thought of what he should do, and he thought of getting married, and he sat down there and put down on a piece of paper the pros and cons of getting married, and ultimately think of a warm fire, home cooking, pleasant company, etc., etc., etc. And he gave himself the final words, marry, marry, marry. And he did on the 29th of January, 1839, and he in fact married his own first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And Darwin had a very contented married life. They had a number of children, 5 of them, 4 of whom were distinguished people. There was Sir George Howard Darwin, who was the Professor of Astronomy, President of the Royal Astronomical Society, or he was the Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge, and the President of the Royal Astronomical Society in 1899. There was Sir Francis Darwin, a botanist. There was Major Leonard Darwin, who was an army engineer, and Sir Horace Darwin, a civil engineer. And of course Darwin himself, the best of all of them, was never knighted. His own cousin, related by 2 generations from Dr. Erasmus Darwin, was Francis Galton. And Francis Galton, amongst many things, framed the universal law of regression. And this was basically every peculiarity of a man is shared by his kin, but on the average to a less degree. In other words, tall fathers tend to have tall sons, but the sons tend to be a bit shorter on the average than the father. And of course it suited Galton to say, well, I'm related to Charles Darwin, and there was no doubt that Galton in his own right was a very intelligent and capable person. Well, then that gives us a bit of an idea of Charles Darwin's background. I find it interesting to recognise that the scientific world was so small in those days and that people knew one another. And in fact, when I was a student at university, 95% of the scientists who had ever lived were living at that stage. The scientific world was quite small. I think that Darwin was the right man in the right place at the right time. But nevertheless, when one looks back at his first letter to Henslow in 1831 and said there that he had indulged in such hypotheses that were they put into action just for a single day, the world would probably come to an end. There's no doubt that, in my mind at all, that had Darwin not been given the one opportunity on the Beagle, that he nevertheless would have come up with major findings and may well have come up with the origin of species had he not gone on the Beagle. One other thing I think which is important is that Darwin had time to reflect on his work. One of the things that I lament at universities these days and in our lives in general is that our students and we don't have sufficient time just to sit down and reflect. There are so many pressures on people these days, and Darwin, as I pointed out, was never employed. He never had an employer for one day of his life, but he occupied himself very, very fully, and I believe, and I think that most people would agree, that modern biology started with Charles Darwin. And as I tell my students, one of his comments was, I have faith in nothing short of actual measurement and rule of 3, and that this is one of the reasons why we have progressed from natural history to biology as a science, and why it was with thought that this was called not a department of biology, but a department of biological sciences. And I'm really thrilled to have an opportunity, hopefully so long as I live that long, to go off to the Galapagos Islands next year and see these organisms that led Darwin to bring to the world most forcibly the main cause of evolution, natural selection. Thanks very much for your patience.
I was only expecting to be away a couple of years, stayed away 5.
I hope so. I hope so. Yes.
Barry, what did he do with Wallace's paper when he was given it to read and realised
Well,
that it was the same?
He then went around amongst his friends and said, what the hell am I to do? Because it was known amongst his friends what he was working on and his ideas. And really, you see, Darwin's book's very difficult to read because it jumps all over the shop. And what Darwin tried to do was, one of Darwin's big stumbling blocks was how do you maintain variation in organisms? Because variation is necessary, because if those organisms that are best adapted to an environment are going to survive, then when you've wiped out those and you get the ones that survive and they breed up, how do you retain variation? And the concept at the time was of what was referred to as blending inheritance. That is, you take a pot of red paint and a pot of white paint, you get pink paint. Take 2 pots of pink paint, you get pink paint. Take 2 pots of pink paint, and you get pink paint. And your variability at the beginning dies out with blending inheritance. And what Darwin didn't realise was Mendelian genetics. That you can take a pot of red paint and a pot of pink paint, and you get 2 pots of pink paint, and out of them you get white paint and red paint back again. That, in fact, although you can mix the units in organisms, they can reappear. The original characteristics can reappear. And so Darwin was at great pains to think, how can variability be retained? And he looked at variability in nature, looked at variability in domesticated animals, and wondered how it was that variability could be maintained. And he's arguing along these lines of variability, not the central thesis of simply assuming variability. And it was these reasons that he was loath to publish at the beginning, because he didn't have all of the answers. Now, the situation today is that there are many things here that in Darwin's book that we don't hold with. For instance, the effects of use and disuse. It was considered that if you were a blacksmith and used your arms all along and grew up big muscles, that your children would grow up with big muscles. And Darwin accepted this concept, which was prevalent at the time, of the effects of use and disuse. And as I say, we don't believe everything that Darwin put there, but his central thesis was correct. When he tried to pull it all together in the chapter that he calls Recapitulation, he didn't do it anywhere near as well as Thomas Matthew did in the page and a half that I've given you. But it was all there. But the big thing about Darwin was that he was able to document every aspect of the concept of evolution by natural selection. But this is why we really do remember him. And so the whole thing was that in 1858, when he got this manuscript from Wallace, Wallace was simply putting down the concept of natural selection of those organisms best adapted to the environment, and had very little to back it up. It was just a logical argument. And he undoubtedly sent it to Darwin because he knew that Darwin was working on the same problem. And Darwin's friends said to him, well, look, you know, it'd be a shame if Wallace got the credit for your concept. And this was why it was a joint presentation to the Linnaean Society on the 1st of July. And very few people think of Wallace these days. But there is a thing called Wallace's Line, which goes between Vale and Lombo.
And the use disuse is coming back, and Ted Steele from Wollongong is very much on the use disuse of his mind.
Yeah, yes, sure.
Well, thanks, Barry, very, very
Very
much.
good.
I think all of us that are going to the Galapagos were very stimulated by it, and I hope that maybe some of the others have
So get your cameras ready for the finches.
Yes, yes. And I'm hoping to organise another night in about 4 weeks' time. Monday night suitable for everyone. And we have the use of this